In the world of online dating, you never truly know who you are talking to behind the screen. What starts as excitement and curiosity can quickly spiral into something dark and unexpected. This is the tragic story of a young woman seeking companionship on Tinder, only to meet a man who wasn't at all what he seemed. This true crime documentary explores the harrowing case of a sugar daddy who, under the guise of wealth and charm, hid something far more sinister. Her trust in him ended in a horrifying murder that shocked the community and the nation. The story begins like many modern-day romances, a chance meeting on Tinder. The victim, a young woman in her mid-20s, was living a vibrant life full of promise. Like many in her generation, she sought companionship online, navigating the world of dating apps with the hope of finding a genuine connection. That's when she stumbled upon the profile of a man much older than her. He was in his mid-40s, portraying himself as successful, charming, and ready to spoil a woman with gifts and attention. He was what some would call a sugar daddy, someone who, in exchange for companionship, promised financial benefits and a lavish lifestyle. To her, this seemed like an exciting opportunity. His profile photos depicted him as someone who was well-dressed, polished, and confident. He showcased images of high-end cars, luxurious vacations, and a lifestyle of comfort that was far from ordinary. His messages reflected a man who knew how to charm. He wasn't crass or vulgar, as many sugar daddies are often stereotyped to be. Instead, he came across as someone who genuinely cared, who was looking for a deeper connection beyond the transactional nature of their arrangement. He complimented her intelligence, her beauty, and made her feel special in ways she hadn't experienced before. For her, it wasn't just about the money or material gain. Despite their age gap, there was something intriguing about him. He seemed worldly and mature, a far cry from the boys her own age who often lacked direction. He promised adventure and excitement, and she was drawn in by the allure of being with someone who could offer her experiences she couldn't afford on her own. However, as their conversations deepened, subtle warning signs began to emerge, though they were easy to miss at first. He was controlling, asking too many questions about her whereabouts, who she was with, and whether she was speaking to other men. In hindsight, these were red flags, but in the moment, they seemed like the typical behavior of an older man trying to be protective and secure in his new relationship. When they finally agreed to meet in person, she was nervous but excited. He had promised to take her to an upscale restaurant and spoil her for the evening, just as he had in their many conversations. She didn't tell many of her friends about the date, keeping it somewhat secret because of the unconventional nature of their connection. But there was a part of her that felt special, that wanted to believe this man truly saw something extraordinary in her. Yet, as we will soon see, her trust in him would become her downfall. On the night of their date, everything seemed to go as planned. At first, they met at a public place, as she had insisted. But after a while, he convinced her to come back to his home for a drink. It wasn't out of the ordinary, and in her mind, she had no reason to fear him. He was older, charming, and they had spent weeks talking. But what she didn't know was that this man had planned something far more sinister than a simple nightcap. Once inside his home, the atmosphere changed. The man she thought she knew started to reveal a darker side. His demeanor shifted, becoming aggressive and impatient. He pressured her to stay, even when she began to feel uncomfortable. The safe, polished image he had cultivated over weeks of messaging began to crumble, exposing a deeply dangerous individual underneath. It was in these moments that the night took a terrifying turn. By the time she realized the danger she was in, it was too late. The man became violent, attacking her in a horrifying, frenzied manner. She fought back, but he was too strong. Her cries for help went unheard in the privacy of his home. What had started as a thrilling date with promises of luxury and excitement had devolved into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The murder was brutal, and the details would later emerge as some of the most chilling aspects of this case. As investigators began piecing together the crime, they started digging into the life of the sugar daddy, now the prime suspect in this horrific murder. What they found was a man with a long history of manipulation, deceit, and even violence, none of which was visible on his seemingly perfect dating profile. His life was built on lies. He had portrayed himself as a successful businessman, but in reality, he was drowning in debt and had a string of failed relationships. Women from his past started to come forward, each with their own disturbing stories of his controlling and abusive behavior. While none of these past incidents had escalated to murder, it became clear that this man had a history of using his power and age to manipulate younger women into vulnerable situations. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that this wasn't the first time he had tried to lure women into dangerous circumstances. Authorities uncovered disturbing messages with other women he had met on Tinder, many of whom had eerily similar experiences. They reported feeling unsafe, manipulated, and controlled, but none of their encounters had ended in violence, until now. As investigators dug further, they found that his violent tendencies went back much further than anyone could have anticipated. His past was riddled with warning signs that had gone unnoticed or were simply brushed aside. In his younger years, there had been allegations of domestic abuse from former partners, though none had resulted in serious charges. These women described him as charming at first, but quickly becoming possessive, demanding, and eventually violent. Many had left before things escalated, but they now realized just how lucky they had been to escape. Beyond his relationships, there were legal troubles related to fraud, financial manipulation, and shady business dealings. He had been involved in numerous failed ventures, each of which ended with his partners being left in financial ruin, while he somehow managed to evade accountability. His polished appearance, the expensive clothes, and luxury cars were all part of an elaborate facade. Much of his wealth was either borrowed or stolen through deceitful schemes. He preyed on people's trust, just as he had done with the young woman he murdered. The most disturbing element of his background, however, was his fascination with control and power. Friends and acquaintances recalled how he would talk about being in control, particularly over women. He believed that because of his age and wealth, he had a right to dominate the women he dated, seeing them as little more than possessions. This mindset had been overlooked or excused by those around him, dismissed as the eccentric behavior of an older, wealthy man. But in reality, it was a sign of a far more dangerous pathology. Psychologists later studying the case suggested that his need for control was deeply rooted in his own insecurities and failures. Despite his outward bravado, he was a man who had never truly succeeded at anything. His businesses had failed, his personal life was in shambles, and he had alienated almost everyone close to him. The only arena where he felt powerful was in his relationships with younger women, who were often too inexperienced or financially dependent to challenge him. But when he met the victim, something snapped. Her resistance, her refusal to play into his manipulative games, triggered a violent outburst that led to her brutal murder. The investigation also revealed disturbing details about his activity on dating platforms like Tinder. He had been using these apps for years, targeting young women with a specific formula. He presented himself as a successful, caring sugar daddy, promising financial support and a lavish lifestyle in exchange for companionship. While some women saw through his lies and left, others, like his victim, were drawn in by the allure of what he promised. For him, the age gap wasn't just about attraction, it was about power. He enjoyed the dynamic of being in control, of holding financial and emotional power over younger, more vulnerable women. In his mind, this justified his increasingly manipulative and violent behavior. In the months leading up to the murder, his behavior had become more erratic. Friends noted that he seemed more stressed, more paranoid. Financial pressure was mounting, and his web of lies was beginning to unravel. It's believed that he saw the victim as both a potential solution to his problems, someone he could control and manipulate, and a final chance to assert his dominance. But when she didn't follow the script he had written in his mind, his frustration turned into rage. The crime scene itself was a chilling reflection of this man's inner turmoil. Forensic experts revealed that the violence was not just a crime of passion, but one of calculated brutality. He had used excessive force, far beyond what was necessary to overpower her, suggesting that this murder wasn't just about silencing her. It was about asserting his power in the most extreme way possible. The level of premeditation was shocking. He had gone into that night fully prepared to commit murder if things didn't go his way, and the evidence showed that he had been spiraling into this dark path for some time. In the aftermath of the murder, Investigators pieced together a timeline of his descent into violence. They discovered that he had been stalking the victim online, tracking her social media posts, and even following her movements through their text messages. He became obsessed with controlling her every action, growing enraged when she didn't immediately respond or when she spent time with others. This obsessive behavior, coupled with his mounting personal failures, created a perfect storm that led to her tragic death. As the investigation unfolded and the public learned more about the sugar daddy's dark past, it became clear that this was not an isolated incident. His history of manipulation, deceit, and violence was a pattern that had gone unchallenged for far too long. He had been allowed to continue his predatory behavior for years, using his charm and resources to escape consequences. But now, in the wake of this heinous crime, there would be no escaping justice. Authorities were determined to bring him to trial and ensure that he would no longer be a threat to society. The weight of his past finally caught up with him, as more and more victims came forward with their own stories of manipulation and abuse. His carefully constructed life of wealth and power crumbled, exposing the monster that had always lurked beneath the surface. The trial would be a grueling process, but it would also serve as a stark reminder of the dangers lurking behind the facade of charm, wealth, and success on the internet. Ultimately, this case served as a tragic reminder of the dark side of online dating, where individuals can easily mask their true identities and intentions. For the young woman, what began as an exciting adventure with promises of a lavish lifestyle ended in unimaginable horror. And for the world watching, it was a chilling example of how easily trust can be exploited, with deadly consequences. The discovery of the crime scene was nothing short of horrifying. Investigators arrived at the sugar daddy's upscale home to find signs of a violent struggle. The home, once a symbol of luxury and success, was now a crime scene forever stained by the brutality that had taken place. Forensic teams meticulously combed through the area, searching for any clues that could provide insight into the events of that night. Blood spatter patterns, broken furniture, and personal belongings scattered throughout the room told a chilling story of a night that started with promises of glamour, but ended in terror. The victim's body was found in a state that deeply disturbed even seasoned detectives. The level of violence she endured was excessive, indicating not just an intent to kill, but to dominate and overpower. The injuries suggested that her death was not quick, it was prolonged, and she had fought hard to survive. Bruising around her wrists and neck indicated that she had been restrained at some point, while defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed that she had tried desperately to protect herself from the attack. The sugar daddy had made an attempt to clean up the scene, but it was sloppy and hastily done. Traces of his DNA were left all over the crime scene, and his fingerprints were found on multiple items, including the weapon used in the murder. The forensic team collected samples from the blood-stained floors, walls, and furniture. They also took note of the scratches on his arms, which matched the victim's attempts to fight back. Surveillance footage from the surrounding area provided key evidence in piecing together the timeline of the night. Cameras showed the couple arriving at the sugar daddy's home after their date. The footage corroborated the victim's friends' accounts of the last time they had heard from her. Phone records indicated that she had texted a friend shortly after arriving at his house, mentioning that things were fine, but that he seemed a little intense. That was the last message she ever sent. After several hours passed without any communication, her friends began to grow worried. When they couldn't reach her, they contacted the authorities. The investigation had already begun before the sugar daddy had a chance to cover his tracks. But the overwhelming amount of physical evidence left behind made it clear that he couldn't escape justice. The forensic evidence was critical, but it wasn't just the blood or fingerprints that sealed his fate. It was the digital trail he left behind. Text messages between the sugar daddy and the victim painted a disturbing picture of his escalating obsession. In the days leading up to their date, he had bombarded her with messages, demanding to know where she was, who she was with, and why she wasn't replying quickly enough. The tone of his messages grew more frantic and controlling, and while she had tried to downplay his intensity, it was clear that she was starting to feel uneasy. These messages, paired with the evidence found at the scene, pointed to a man who had been losing control long before the night of the murder. But the most damning piece of evidence came from a search history found on the sugar daddy's computer. In the weeks before the crime, he had been researching methods of restraint and violence. He had even looked up articles about controlling relationships and the psychology of power dynamics between older men and younger women. This premeditation suggested that while the violence of the murder may have escalated in the heat of the moment, the sugar daddy had already been contemplating dark actions. When authorities arrested him, he denied everything at first, claiming that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He tried to maintain the persona he had cultivated for so long, the polished, successful businessman who was simply misunderstood. But as the evidence mounted, his story began to fall apart. He was charged with murder, and the case was taken to court. The trial was nothing short of a spectacle. The prosecution presented a detailed, methodical case, walking the jury through the timeline of the crime, the mounting evidence, and the sugar daddy's history of controlling and abusive behavior. They painted him as a predator who had used his wealth and status to lure young women into his life, only to dominate and control them. They argued that the murder was the culmination of years of unchecked power and obsession, which finally exploded in a horrific act of violence. In the courtroom, the victim's family sat, devastated by the loss of their daughter, sister, and friend. They listened in horror as the prosecution detailed the brutality of her final moments. The forensic experts described the injuries she sustained, the struggles she endured, and the overwhelming violence that led to her death. The evidence was clear. This was not a crime of passion, but one of control and domination. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint a different picture. They argued that the sugar daddy had been pushed to the edge by financial stress and personal failure, and that the crime was a tragic accident rather than a calculated murder. They tried to portray him as a broken man who had lost control in a moment of weakness, not a predator with a history of manipulation. They even attempted to shift blame to the victim, suggesting that their relationship had been mutually beneficial and consensual, an argument that outraged both the victim's family and the public. The trial stretched on for weeks, with both sides presenting their case in exhaustive detail. The prosecution's star witnesses included the forensic experts who had pieced together the crime scene, as well as former partners of the sugar daddy who testified about his controlling behavior. Their stories painted a chilling pattern of manipulation and abuse, reinforcing the idea that the murder had been a long time coming. One ex-girlfriend even broke down on the stand, describing how she had narrowly escaped a similar fate, her testimony leaving a lasting impact on the jury. The digital evidence proved to be the final nail in the coffin for the defense. The text messages, the internet searches, and the surveillance footage were undeniable. The jury was presented with a man who had meticulously planned for violence, a man whose obsession with power and control had driven him to murder. In the end, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase of the trial was equally emotional. The victim's family delivered powerful victim impact statements, describing the devastating loss they had suffered. They spoke about the bright future their daughter had ahead of her, the dreams she would never achieve, and the hole her death had left in their lives. The judge, clearly moved by the brutality of the crime and the pain it had caused, handed down the maximum sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the trial came to a close, there was a sense of justice being served, though it could never bring back the young woman whose life had been so tragically cut short. The case became a landmark in discussions about the dangers of online dating and the dark side of the sugar daddy culture. It sparked debates about the power dynamics between older, wealthy men and younger, vulnerable women, and the ways in which predators can use dating apps to find their victims. The victim's family turned their grief into action, creating a foundation in her name to raise awareness about the risks of online dating and to support victims of domestic violence and abuse. They hoped that by sharing her story, they could prevent future tragedies and encourage young women to be more cautious when entering relationships with men who may seem too good to be true. The legacy of the case lives on, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a stark reminder that evil can often hide behind a mask of charm and success. The sugar daddy, once a man who seemed to have everything, was now a convicted murderer, exposed for the monster he had always been underneath his polished facade. His life of lies and manipulation had finally caught up with him, and he would spend the rest of his days paying for the unspeakable crime he committed.